painful, divisive, but in the end, decisive.
The majority of valid votes cast yesterday by the people of Scotland were in favour of no.
Just 6 years ago, Scotland rejected independence, a result both sides agreed to respect.
I call on all of Scotland to follow suit in accepting the democratic verdict of the people of Scotland.
But now Nicola Sturgeon is stepping up her calls for a second referendum. A formal demand will be tabled if the SNP wins a majority in next May's Scottish parliamentary elections.
Brexit and the way in which Brexit is being implemented immeasurably strengthens the case for Scotland becoming an independent country with the ability to shape our own destiny and contribute positively to Europe and the world.
Here in Downing Street, there is a very simple answer to Nicola Sturgeon. No to a second referendum, whatever happens next year. But some Tory thinking is evolving. One grandee told me, if the SNP win a majority next year, we won't be able to keep sticking our fingers in our ears. We'll have to box cleverer than that. If not, the SNP will outmaneuver us. One idea is to look to Australia, where monarchists defeated a challenge by Republicans after asking voters to choose an alternative. There was no agreement. Some Conservatives are now suggesting that the terms of an exit deal for Scotland should be on the ballot if a referendum is held. Here's the former Conservative Chief Whip on Newsnight earlier this week.
Brexit has made the case for the Union more difficult to push in Scotland. And we need to make certain that if there is going to be another referendum, and I think it will be very difficult to resist if the SNP get a strong vote next year, then in that case people need to be aware of what the consequences of dissolving the Union would be before they cast a vote.
This drew on an idea from the man who led the winning pro-union campaign in 2014.
But I do think if there is another one, then when the legislation is passed to enable it, then it should be incumbent on the other side to have a done deal, something to vote on, so that we knew what the choices were.
The new leader of the Scottish Conservatives, now the largest pro-union party in Holyrood, believes a referendum on an exit deal would be unwise.
The people of Scotland have already seen what they were voting on. They saw that just 6 years ago when people looked at the arguments for separating Scotland or for remaining part of the United Kingdom, and they saw on a range of issues, whether it was about our currency, our economy, how the broad shoulders of the United Kingdom can support every part of the country and every part of Scotland. They saw that evidence then and they voted to remain part of the UK. And I think, again, any discussion about alternative ways of running a campaign simply suits Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP because it allows her and the party to deflect on and away from their dismal domestic record.
The SNP is dismissive for different reasons.
I think justifying the UK and Scotland's presence in it is much harder than the questions that would be asked of the Scottish National Party during this debate, because what we would be saying to people, as we have to say to people, is there's no status quo. There is no status quo left. What there is Brexit Britain, which regrettably, and I feel very sorry for people, is going backwards, or a normal, small, efficient, modern country being part of the EU, like every other sensible country. I think that when that question is put that way, I think it's the UK that comes up one thing.
With a fight underway to preserve the Union, Downing Street believes it holds the trump card, control over a legal referendum. The SNP is battling hard to prise that card out of its hand.
Joining me now is Sir John Curtis, Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde, Jamie Green, Conservative Member of the Scottish Parliament, and Dr Philippa Whitford, a Scottish National Party MP. May I start with you this evening, John? Can Boris Johnson's government, on a democratic basis, keep saying no to another Scottish independence referendum?
Well, it depends what you mean by the word democratic in that question. Of course, the argument that the UK government and many other unions alongside them have been making and will continue to make between now and next May's devolved election is indeed that the SNP, in their view, promised that the 2014 referendum was going to be in a once-in-a-generation event and that they should stick to that. The trouble with that argument, however, is that while you might want to argue that your opponents should keep what you think were their promises, you cannot assume that the electorate have to be bound by those promises. And if the SNP do go into the Hollywood elections saying, we want another referendum just like 2014, that's what you're voting for, and they get an overall majority in that election, then the truth is the question the UK government will have to face, well, look, if that isn't adequate evidence that a referendum should be held, then what would be? Because, of course, what would be true is that such an outcome would replicate the outcome in 2011, which for David Cameron was sufficient evidence that the SNP had the moral right to hold a referendum on independence. And it would also replicate the position in 2015 when David Cameron, again, because he had an overall majority in that election, regarded that as a mandate for holding the referendum on Brexit. So the difficulty, I think, is that precedent would make the argument difficult to pursue. And certainly if you're concerned about democracy, then you have to say, well, what signal do you expect the people to send other than giving the SNP a majority?
Can the Scottish Parliament force it? Do they have the mechanism to do so?
Well, that is a much cloudier issue. If we go back to the minority SNP administration of 2007 to 2011, which now seems to be the dim and distant past, at that point, the Scottish Government did come up with proposals for holding a referendum, which it argued would be legal within the terms of the Scotland Act. And essentially, it was an argument that said, let's hold a referendum on mandating the Scottish Government to enter into negotiations with the UK government. Now, I think the honest truth is that at that time, when that proposal was being discussed, whenever 2 or 3 lawyers were gathered together, there were at least a half a dozen opinions being expressed. But I think it's worth being aware that it might just be true that perhaps the UK Supreme Court, a body which, of course, for which Boris Johnson has quite considerable affection, might possibly, conceivably, when faced with a proposal for a Scottish referendum that is different from the one in 2014, might just say, actually, it can go ahead.
Well, this will be things to watch, depending on the cards that Number 10 play, and, of course, how the Scottish Parliament elections go. What do you make of this strategy, this perhaps change of thinking in certain Conservative circles, to force a deal to be done before any referendum took place, so that people would be voting on an actual deal, which, of course, many have said they may have liked that option with the EU referendum?
Well, I can understand why somebody might think that's a good idea, because presumably what you're hoping is that by laying out a specific vision of independence, then people would say, well, I don't like that bit and I don't like that bit, and therefore, as a result, support tails off. The risk, however, is that you will be turning something which at the moment might be regarded as a nationalist aspiration if you are a unionist, indeed a nationalist fantasy, into something that was actually a concrete proposal. And I think the risk would be is you would actually be making independence look a much more concrete prospect, something that might actually happen, as opposed to what was the case in 2014. Yes, we had a 600-page promissory note from the Scottish Government as to what they thought would happen, but actually the card that the UK government and the no side played during the 2014 referendum was, well, actually, don't assume that we're going to sign up to that. And I think for them, at that time at least, they regarded that position as being advantageous to them.
John Curtis, if you were a betting man, what are the odds, do you think, of having another Scottish independence referendum anytime soon? Where do you think it is at the moment?
Well, in part, of course, it's in the hands of no politician, because the Scottish Government already had to delay the referendum because of the coronavirus pandemic. And until we're in a post-pandemic world, it isn't going to happen. But at the moment, one has to say the SNP are well ahead in the opinion polls for next May. They certainly have a better than a 50% chance of being able to get an overall majority. And if that does happen, then I think it will be difficult to avoid another referendum within, shall we say, a 2 or 3 year time period.
Well, there you go, some numbers around that. Let's welcome to us then to talk about this Jamie Green, the Conservative Education spokesperson, member of the Scottish Parliament. Jamie, you've just heard there some evidence around this. I also wondered if you agree with the former Conservative Chief Whip, Andrew Mitchell, who was on the programme earlier in the week, that if the SNP do win big in the Scottish elections, it becomes very difficult to resist another independence referendum. That's how he put it. Do you agree?
I don't. quite simply. Just from the outset, let me say that I think people watching this programme will be astonished that we're spending 10 minutes rerunning debates about constitutional issues and referendums in the middle of a global health emergency, when huge swaths of Scotland, nearly 1 million people in the metropolitan area of Glasgow, are currently under renewed lockdown restrictions. People are facing down the barrel of an economic and health crisis, the likes of which we've never seen. I think this
maybe they don't like who's running the overall country, and maybe they want to change. Maybe that's why every election that they have any chance in voting for, they keep returning the SNP in majority.
Well, the Scottish election is 8 months away, and what I don't want to be doing is spending the next 8 months debating the old arguments of constitutional division and distraction from the day job ahead of us. The real priorities for all politicians, whatever your views on the Union or separation from the UK, should be about our health service, social care and our economy.
Do you think the Prime Minister got that memo? Because apparently he spent some time in his first cabinet meeting since summer recess focused on this precise issue. Surely it's not remiss of Newsnight to also spend a bit of time on it if the Prime Minister deems it fit?
Well, look, I mean, the First Minister came to Parliament last week in her programme for government and said that she was introducing a referendums bill. And I find that astonishing. I mean, right now, the duty of all governments, and Scotland has 2 governments, and they both have a very important role to play in this. The duty of both of Scotland's governments right now is to get Scotland back up and running, is to protect the health of our nation, not to be running referendums and putting through legislation which is going to distract.
Sorry, Jamie, you're a man who supports the will of the people. You're a Brexiteer. Are you just a fan of picking and choosing the democracy that you like? This is precisely about your point, about who people wish to be run by, governed by.
Scotland has had 2 referendums, one on independence and one on Brexit. The UK voted to leave the EU, and we have left the EU. Scotland voted to remain part of the United Kingdom, and I respect that result as well. The SNP refused to accept the result of both of those referendums, and quite frankly, it's about time that they focused on health, education and the economy.
Well, you could do more than one thing in government, as people would argue, and I'm sure you have to do that all the time. Let's bring in Philippa Whitford at this point. There is a point here. Some people may be tuning into Newsnight thinking, right, where's the latest on test and trace? If we're going to talk about Scotland, let's talk about the health issues there. Why is this something that you're wasting time on during such an important moment in our whole world's health?
Well, I don't think anyone can say our First Minister has not been doing the day job for the last 7 months. She has been focused on nothing else. She has been asked at press briefings all the time, very political questions to tempt her to get into politics or take a pop at others, and she has declined. She's remained utterly focused. And in Scotland, our test and protect system is actually working really well. They are reaching over 99% of cases and contacts. You know, it would be good to see that across the UK. And that's why actually some people south of the border listen to the First Minister's briefings rather than the disappeared briefings.
OK, you say people have been tempting her. I'm sorry to interrupt there, but, you know, she didn't have to make this big statement earlier in the week about another referendum. That didn't have to be part of her play right now. What about this idea of uniting? What about this idea of uniting the country at this time and putting all those other things to one side?
Well, the thing is, we do face an election next summer, and therefore it has to be very clear to the people of Scotland that the SNP are going for independence, because we can't just sit here not getting any help from, you know, Jamie talks about our 2 governments. Well, it's his government that are winding up furlough next month that's going to make thousands of people unemployed. It's his Chancellor who, when he announced 30 billion for supposedly relaunching the economy, Scotland gets 21 million of that. Can't do anything with that. So in actual fact, we need to invest to get out of this. The Chancellor is already talking about public sector pay freezes and tax rises. We're looking at another 10 years of Tory austerity. That will not get us out of it. And therefore, Scotland needs the powers to actually borrow, to invest and to actually restructure our economy. As Mark Blythe said, this is a problem, right? I didn't interrupt you, Jamie, so just let me speak. Mark Blythe pointed out that Scotland, after London and the southeast areas, Scotland is actually got the highest GDP and makes the biggest revenue contribution. But all the other parts of the UK sit there with their tin cup out, waiting for London to give them money. That is not what we're looking for. We want to invest our way forward, and we can't do that with no borrowing powers and no economic powers going forward.
Well, I mean, Jamie, you were trying to get in there, you're making some point, I presume, there about some of the figures. What were you just trying to say so we could hear?
The very obvious point is that Scotland has a £15 billion deficit, and Philippa knows that. Philippa knows that it's the broad shoulders of the UK that have provided the job retention scheme that she's criticising. It's the UK government and the broad shoulders of being a nation of four nations that have been able to introduce business grants, that the Eat Out to Help Out scheme has kept so many restaurants open and kept so many people in jobs.
May I now just bring you both to something else completely, which was raised in our report by Nick Watt, because rather than debating where money has come from, where money is going to, I'm actually quite keen to hear both of your views on this idea of having a deal in place before another potential referendum. What do you make of that idea, Jamie? Because it could be a strategy, from your point of view as a unionist, that would put you in a stronger position before that referendum if it happened.
Well, let me say, we had a referendum in 2014. Scotland voted, and I respect that. It was a once in a generation vote. We have much more important things to be getting on with right now as a country. We are facing...
I know, I'm asking you to confront that potential reality based on what you just heard from Sir John Curtis. Could you at least entertain the idea and tell us your view?
Well, there's not going to be another referendum because, frankly, Scotland needs to move forward in a positive direction. Let's not go back to the bitter divisions of the past that Philippa wants to take us back to. Let's move forward. Let's bring Scotland in to the next year in a positive way that brings us out of the current crisis that we're in and focuses on the real priorities of the people of Scotland.
Right, well, Philippa, you might as well pack up and go home. There's not going to be another referendum. You've heard it here. And I wonder what your plan is, because if you're just relying on the will of Boris Johnson to give it to you, it doesn't sound likely.
Well, all of the parties, including Jamie's, signed up to the Smith Commission. And what it said in the Smith Commission is it is agreed that nothing in this report prevents Scotland from becoming an independent country in the future should the people of Scotland so choose. That was after the 2014 referendum, and it was signed by all 5 parties. It's not just Nicola Sturgeon asking for independence. The people of Scotland have voted as a majority for the SNP in the last 6 elections. If it happens again next May, it's 7. And it just simply is not tenable to go on like a bad marriage.
But Philippa, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? Are you going to go to court? Can you just tell us? Is there a strategy if Boris Johnson doesn't do as you want? What are you going to do?
Well, I'm not going to discuss the strategy. Some of that's above my pay grade.
Oh, go on. You can tell us here at Newsnight.
Well, it is above my pay grade. It won't be my decision. But I do think that if he goes on doing that, and particularly if he goes on doing that between the election and whenever the referendum finally comes, he will simply drive support up. You know, they talked about...
We're going to have to leave it there. I don't think this will be the last time we will have these conversations. I'm so sorry to cut across you there, but thank you very much to all of you this evening.